The family was eating dinner in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. Who could that be, wondered Dad, and he went to see. The others could hear excited voices in the hallway. Sounds like a long-lost friend, remarked Amy. It certainly does, said Mom, and she went to investigate too. She left the door open so this time the children could hear what was happening. Jane. Dad was saying. Look who's here. There was a short pause as if Mum wasn't sure who was here, and then she exclaimed. Steve! It's you! It's years since we saw you. Come in. We're having our dinner. Come and join us. A young man was ushered into the kitchen. He was tall and fair, well-dressed, with a healthy-looking face. You must be Mark, he said, smiling broadly. I met you when you were a baby. I've never met your sister, though. This is Amy, said Dad. Move up there, Amy, and make space for Steve. Mum was scurrying about, fetching extra cutlery and heating up some lasagna in the microwave. Steve made himself comfortable. He thanked Mum for the reheated lasagna and declared it to be the best he had ever tasted. He chatted to Mark and Amy, and Mark found himself chatting back as if he'd known him all his life. He liked this Steve, whoever he was. So what have you been doing with yourself? Asked Dad. Steve tipped back his chair onto two legs and folded his arms. Well, I've not been doing too badly. I have my own business now. It's been going a good few years and I'm looking to expand. That's actually why I'm here. I've taken an office in High Street and I'm hoping to spend a couple of weeks getting things up and running. That's great, said Dad. We'll be able to see some more of you. Everyone at church will be really pleased to see an old face. I'll probably be going home at weekends, said Steve quickly. Are you still involved with the same church? Mum wanted to know. You were so excited about it when you first moved down there. For the first time Steve seemed stuck for words. Listen, folks, he said. Thanks a million for the meal. I'll really have to fly now. I've a stack of paperwork to do. I'll see you again. Great meeting you kids. The whole family clustered round the door to see Steve off. Some car, said Mark in admiration. Who is Steve? Asked Amy as they went back into the kitchen to clear up. Steve's an old friend of ours. We were all young people together, said Mum. Mark's mouth dropped open. You're not telling us Steve is the same age as you? Do you think he looks older? Teased Dad. Younger, said Amy innocently. I can't imagine you dressing like that. Or driving a sports car, added Mark. Dad laughed. I don't think we'd all fit in Steve's car. And if we look old, it's because of all the worry and sleepless nights we've had with you too. Mum looked more serious. I wouldn't change places with him for the world. I felt worried about him. I'd say it's a case of, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What do you mean by that? Asked Mark. I liked him. Of course you did, said Dad. He's just as likable as he always was, but I understand what Mum means. When we knew Steve years ago, he was a bright Christian who put God first in his life. Now it looks as if getting on well has become the most important thing for him. That can easily happen to any of us. Other things creep in and become our treasure. They push Jesus to the side. That's why Jesus warns his followers to store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. He's reminding us to concentrate most on the things which will last forever. I still wouldn't mind a car like that when I grow up, said Mark. Who wouldn't? Smiled Dad. Just don't make it your main goal. A few days later Mark came home from school to find Amy dancing round the living room in a new pair of sandals. Do you like them? She asked. They have a heel. Very nice, said Mark, without paying much attention. Mum bought you trainers too. Amy went on. Vincent's had a sale. Is this them? Growled Mark, picking up a carrier bag from the corner of the settee. Vincent's for value, it said in large orange letters. He pulled out the trainers and groaned in disgust. Value, maybe, style, definitely not. Mom came into the room. How are the trainers? She asked, but she didn't wait for an answer. I thought they were more or less the same as the ones you tried on last Saturday, and they were about a fifth of the price. I'm sure they were, thought Mark, but he didn't say anything. He had tried before to explain to Mum about the important differences between trainers, but she just didn't seem able to grasp it. Unfortunately, the Vincent's trainers were a perfect fit. That's you all sorted for tomorrow, then, said Mum. The next day Mark's class was going on a field trip to the coast to study sand dunes. They were allowed to wear their ordinary clothes. Mark came down to breakfast in his old trainers, but Mum spotted them immediately. Mark, you're going nowhere wearing those trainers. Your toe is poking out the end. Why do you think I bought you new ones yesterday? As Mark shuffled slowly down High Street on his way to school, he heard the sound of a car horn and turned to see Steve sitting in his cool sports car in a queue stopped at a red light. No school today, he called over to Mark, eyeing his casual clothes. Mark wished again that he wasn't wearing these trainers. He explained about the field trip. Steve fished in the inside pocket of his suit and held out his hand to Mark. Everyone needs something for a trip, he said. Come over here, quick, the lights are about to change. Mark stepped into the road, and Steve put something into his hand. Then the lights did change, and the cars moved off. Mark returned to the safety of the pavement before looking at what Steve had given him. 10 pounds. That was a good start. He had decided last night that he was going to have a trainer's fund and save as hard as he could until he had enough money to buy the trainers he really wanted. He had already been trying to think how he could raise some extra cash. On the way down the street he stopped to look in the sports shop window. He looked at the price tags too. This was going to be a long-term project. Mark hung back when everyone was boarding the bus at the school, partly because he felt like a freak in these trainers and partly because his mind was still taken up with his trainer's fund. The result was that he ended up sitting next to Jim Parker. No one ever chose to sit next to Jim, everyone thought he was boring. At first Mark didn't even recognize him. He looked quite different without his school uniform. He was wearing a pullover that might have been his dad's, a pair of half-mast jeans and his school shoes. At least he was hardly likely to comment on Mark's new trainers. But what were they going to talk about during the journey? Mark couldn't remember ever having had a conversation with Jim. He needn't have worried. Jim had plenty to say. He knew lots of riddles, could make witty, off-the-cuff puns and had a head full of statistics, football scores, populations, world records. He kept Mark entertained all the way to the coast, and he turned out to be a good partner for the research on the sand dunes. Geography had never been Mark's strong point, but Jim seemed to be on top of it. When the class had completed their worksheets, Miss Gilmore announced that everyone could spend some time in the nearby seaside town, as long as no one wandered off on his or her own and as long as everyone was back at the bus by 3 o'clock. Most of the class headed into town to look at the shops or search out a cafe, but Mark was trying to save his money, and Jim didn't seem to have any, so they made for the pier and found themselves a bench near the lighthouse, which was right at the end. As it was the middle of a weekday afternoon and not particularly warm, there were not many people about. The boys watched 1 or 2 fishing boats and a few yachts bobbing up and down in the harbor. Suddenly Jim pulled himself up on the seat and looked all around him. "Where did that little boy go?" he asked. Mark shrugged. He had noticed a child running past them a few moments earlier, but he had thought nothing of it. Jim jumped to his feet, obviously concerned. The next moment he was dashing along the pier in the direction of the lighthouse. Mark was about to follow when he noticed a stout elderly lady running towards him from the opposite direction. She was panting hard and looked worried. "Have you seen my Danny?" she puffed. "He's only 4. I took my eyes off him for 2 seconds and he was gone. Oh dear, oh dear. My daughter said he would be too much for me, but I thought a day at the seaside would be so nice." She blew her nose and looked around. Mark looked around too. There was no sign of Danny, or of Jim. Either they had disappeared behind the lighthouse or they had fallen over the edge. He decided to try behind the lighthouse first. After one quick look, he stepped back. It might be better if the stout lady did not see what was happening here. The lighthouse really was at the very edge of the pier. There was only a narrow ledge between it and the sea. About halfway round this ledge, with his back against the wall of the lighthouse, stood a small boy in a red jacket. He was staring out to sea with a look of sheer terror on his face. Edging his way carefully along the ledge towards the boy was Jim. "What's wrong?" wailed the lady. Mark felt uncomfortable. Reassuring elderly ladies was not really his thing, especially when he felt so unsure himself. "Everything's going to be all right," he said, and they stood looking at each other for what felt like forever. "Granny," said a small, wobbly voice at last, and they turned round to see the white-faced little boy coming towards them, clutching Jim by the hand. The lady hugged and kissed and scolded Danny. Then she turned to Jim. She hugged him too and called him a wonderful boy and a hero. Jim looked embarrassed and said it was nothing. Indeed, it was not nothing. "How can I thank you enough? I want to give you something." She took a £5 note out of her purse and slipped it into Jim's hand before he could protest. Still thanking Jim and scolding Danny, she took a tight hold of her grandson's arm and headed back down the pier. Mark and Jim sat down on their old bench. Jim was quiet. "You okay?" asked Mark. "Just a bit shaky. It's really narrow there." The kid had lost his nerve and he froze. "I don't know what I'd have done if he hadn't taken my hand and let me coax him into coming back with me." "You were amazing," said Mark. Jim shrugged, as if he rescued people every day, and changed the subject. "Let's take a walk into town," he suggested. The Thursday market was in full swing. The boys wandered about, looking at the various stalls. There were fish and vegetables, buckets and spades, watches, clothes, shoes, homemade cakes, sticks of rock and lollipops as big as your face. Jim stopped at a stall selling all kinds of shoes. Look, there are trainers just like yours. There was the slightest trace of envy in his voice. The stall holder pounced. Lovely trainers, son. Latest style, and only a tenner. What size do you need? Size 6, said Jim. But I won't try today. I was only looking. They moved on to the toy stall. Jim bought a doll in a yellow plastic raincoat. Mark hoped he would keep it hidden from the other boys. It's my sister's birthday on Saturday, explained Jim. Funny, we have the same birthday, only I'm the oldest and she's the youngest. Mark didn't spend any money. Nothing was going to eat into his trainer fund. But he did feel sort of mean when Jim bought them both an ice cream. At 3:05 Miss Gilmore was walking up and down the bus counting heads. Who's missing? She asked, pointing to the empty seat beside Jim. Mark, chorused everyone, but at that very moment Mark appeared holding a flimsy, white plastic bag. Mark, what time were you told to be back here? Asked Miss Gilmore crossly, but Mark apologized so nicely that she just shook her head and stepped back to let him reach his seat. As he made his way up the bus, Chris put out a leg to stop him. Why didn't you come with us? I'm sure you had a great afternoon with Jim Parker. You should have seen what Jim did. He was amazing. Mark, we have already waited quite long enough for you. Will you sit down? Shouted Miss Gilmore. I'll tell you later, said Mark, and he wondered if his story would change the others' opinion of Jim. Where were you? Asked Jim. Instead of answering, Mark tossed the white bag into Jim's lap. Happy birthday for Saturday. Jim pulled out a pair of the 10-pound trainers. He looked pleased, but then his face fell. He'd thought of a few objections. But, Mark, you said you were saving up for something special. I'm not anymore. I'm not that bothered about having it now. Anyway, just thinking about how I could get it was starting to take over my life. I've more important things to think about. But what about your mum? Jim asked next. What will she think of you spending all your money on me? Mark grinned. Don't worry about that. If it's to do with a bargain in trainers, my mum is sure to approve.